How has my background influenced my reading of the New Testament? Well, from a very young age, I was always taught the importance of the New Testament and how it's central to the Christian life, and that we need to be conscious when we read it to learn the lessons that it has to teach. And so I think from the very beginning of my education, the New Testament was taught in more or less a classroom fashion, or from the pulpit. And so when it comes to reading the New Testament, my background has influenced me in the way of whenever I am in the New Testament and reading it, I tend to think of it in a classroom mentality, as if I'm a student. And this provides challenges for me when I want to step into a parable or a story from the New Testament, for instance, and I don't take the time to feel and to think about the characters and to learn from the words of Christ instead of simply analyzing them in a student fashion. So that's one of the biggest ways that my background has influenced how I read the New Testament. I was also taught that the New Testament is inerrant in everything, and so if I ever find something that doesn't seem to connect quite right, I always have that belief in the back of my brain that it's inerrant, and so if there's something I don't understand about it, that would be my fault, and something that I need to figure out on my own or seek advice or help from. So some of my favorite themes or symbols from the New Testament would be basically the themes of grace and the themes of man's sin contrasted against God's holiness. And I love the parable or the story when a woman, a sinner, according to the Pharisee, comes to Jesus as he's sitting in the Pharisee's home as his lunch guest, and the woman comes to Jesus and falls at his feet and begins to clean his feet with her tears and anoints his head or his feet with oil. And the Pharisee thinks to himself, Jesus would know that this woman is a sinner, he wouldn't let her touch him. And Jesus, knowing this, looks at the Pharisee and tells him a parable of two men, both who owed their master money, one 500 days' wages and another 50 days' wages. And although neither of the men could pay it, the master forgave both of them. And he posed this question to the Pharisee. He asked, between the two men, which one would love their master more? And the Pharisee answered correctly to say that the one who had been forgiven more would love more. And that story always sticks out to me a great deal. And it brings out the themes of God's holiness and his desirability, and the amount to which we should love him will depend really on whether or not, the amount I love him will depend on how well I have grasped my sinful heart and what I've been saved from. And so I think back to that story very often when I find my life lacking love for Christ. I think about, I realize that I probably am not realizing the amount of sin that I've been saved from, and so I love God little. And the themes that I don't pay much attention to in the New Testament, they would be end-time themes from Revelation, the book of the Revelation. There are lots of opinions and ideas that get flown around, and people sometimes hold very strongly to them, and perhaps I've desired to avoid pushing through that slough, if you will, and I don't want to form an opinion of my own, because then I'd have to stand by it. But perhaps I should get more interested in the end times, because I also love the theme of glorification and what our life will be like post-earth. And if I were to study the end times and become familiar with them, for sure I might find more hope in moments in my life where I could use those. So, yeah, that is my summary of the New Testament from my perspective.